Pararahamino, pararahamin, pararahamino, pararahamin.
Sikon. Acknowledgements are, in a concept I'll convey in my own Haudenosaunee terms, are means to set good intentions, to acknowledge our gifts and come together with a good mind, to listen to all our relations, the human and the more than human. They are the words that come before all else, to ground us and situate us with good intentions and recognize all our relatives, the human and the more than human. With that, I start with the acknowledgement we worked on with the Tomva cultural leaders and educators. Today, we acknowledge the Tomva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tonawanda, Los Angeles Basin and Southern California Channel Islands. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarakton in this place, UCLA. As the land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hunikvatam, the Ahiram, and the Iyohinkam, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emergent. Wherever you are at, we welcome you to reflect on the original caretakers of the land you sit on, and welcome our emerging learners as we sit here together in our respective homes. And our discussion of mapping is one to discuss solidarity practice and a turn towards spatial justice. We must begin here with the words before all else, to acknowledge how we must interdialogue with the respect to the original caretakers and understanding our relationships to each other in a renewal and a continuation. And now we put our minds together as one. Yahweh.
Thank you so much, Mishuana, for opening our program in such a beautiful way. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the Curator of Public Programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. We're so pleased that everyone could join us today. Today's program, Crafting Cartographies, Mapping LA, is the first in a new series of programs titled Engaging Lived Religion. The program will begin with brief overviews of the work achieved thus far by 3 distinct mapping initiatives hosted at UCLA: Mapping Indigenous LA, Mapping Jewish LA, and Mapping Religion along Vermont Avenue. A conversation will follow, moderated by Genevieve Carpio, Assistant Professor in the Cesare Chavez Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies at UCLA. Before I hand it off, a quick technical note to make for the best viewing experience. Once the screen sharing begins, I encourage you to click View Options and then select Side-by-Side mode, which will allow you to see all of our guests simultaneously during the presentations. And now a word about today's program from Amy Landau, the Fowler's Director of Education and Interpretation and co-director of the Fowler's new initiative, Engaging Lived Religion in the 21st Century Museum, alongside Patrick Polk.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have a great crowd tonight. The Fowler organized this program as part of the museum's initiative called Engaging Lived Religion in the 21st Century Museum. This project is generously funded by the Lilly Endowment. This 3-year project expands the Fowler's ongoing engagement with religious and spiritual traditions and increases community participation in museum exhibitions and programs. Today's panelists will discuss the ways communities inscribe their communal, cultural, and spiritual relationships onto the physical geographies of Los Angeles. These carefully crafted narratives offer insights into different worldviews. As a 20th century cartographer, J.B. Harley wrote, "Cartography is never merely the drawing of maps. It's the making of worlds." Digital mapping offers endless possibilities in describing and sharing those worlds. It opens the door to broad participation, as well as competing narratives. Initiatives like the ones presented today elevate knowledge held by our community members. They rely on their participation and share human stories that often are untold. Museums can learn much from participatory projects that highlight the power of self-representation. Ceding the power of representation to those who are being represented is a crucial and basic decolonizing practice. We hope today's conversation will offer new ideas and possibilities for museums to better understand and interpret the lives and the legacies of their most important stakeholders, those with whom they share a city. So now I turn the mic back over to our wonderful moderator, Genevieve.
Thank you, Amy. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists, Professor Mishuana Goeman of the Tonawanda Band of Seneca, who is a special advisor to the Chancellor on Native American and Indigenous Affairs at UCLA, Craig Torres, Tongva educator and contributor to UCLA's Mapping Indigenous LA, Julianne Anesi, assistant professor of gender studies at UCLA, Todd Presner, chair of UCLA's Digital Humanities program, and the Michael and Irene Ross Professor of Germanic Languages and Comparative Literature, Caroline Luce, associate director of the UCLA Allen D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, and chief digital curator of Mapping Jewish LA, Patrick Polk, senior curator of Caribbean and Latin American popular arts, Fowler Museum at UCLA, and lecturer in the UCLA Department of World Arts and Cultures / Dance. Christopher Greene, former curatorial assistant and geographic information systems specialist for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. So with that, we're going to start today's program with a presentation from Mapping Indigenous LA.
Hi, everyone. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm going to start with just a very quick story because I want to leave time for our esteemed guest, Craig Torres, to speak, because Craig is the one who lives and has breathed the land around us for many years. But I want to start with how this project came to be a bit, just a short version. And this is from my perspective, or how I became involved. I wrote a book on mapping and cartography, Indigenous cartography, and the ways that Native women's stories tell a different story of this land and a different story of how to relate to this land to produce healthier Native communities. I was out at PIMU with the esteemed Wendy Teeter and Desiree Martinez for their archaeology field school. PIMU, for those of you who are unaware, it's on this map here, which you can guess is Catalina Island. And out at PIMU, there is this moment where there was a misunderstanding between relocated American Indians and who actually belonged at that village site. So through that, what came to be known is that really a lot of Indigenous people are in LA, but because of the way that it's structured, that a lot of people weren't talking amongst each other. When I got home and I told this particular story, which is rather lengthy, so I don't have time to go into it. When I told this story to my friends, Keith Camacho and Maylee Blackwell, we as faculty had time to talk about these issues of which we deeply cared about, which is Indigenous protocols, Indigenous peoples, and how we relate to each other, and how do we make place within the city, particularly of Los Angeles. So this is kind of how we got together and did this project, which was started from an Institute of American Culture's Dream Fund. And within that, we thought about all these different maps. Now, over the course of the years, there has had to be changes by necessity, and we learned as we went along. So in this respect, we learned also about what keeps us apart, and sometimes the different sites of enclosure to different ways that we as Indigenous peoples in the cities make place, and the different ways we've talked to each other. And we've seen quite a development over the years, which has been really great with this particular mapping project and beginning to understand who we are as peoples together. I have for you, on the side here in the slide, you will see different representations of 3 different maps. This first map, which you also see behind me, coincidentally, is River Garza's map that is down on Winston Street in downtown Los Angeles. People often refer to this as Indian Alley as well. And it's just a beautiful way for American Indians to reclaim space through particular artwork. So I highly suggest seeing it in Los Angeles if you get a chance. The second map that you see here is Heyday Maps, and Cindy Elvitre, who is a head member of the TIAT Society and had worked very hard with us on creating Mapping Indigenous LA, along with Desiree Martinez, This is a particular representation that's a little more like a Cartesian map that you might be used to. And then on the third, this is River Garza also, and this is a map we had commissioned for him for UCLA as part of the land acknowledgement process. Now, eventually there'll be stickers and posters available so you can reach out, but with COVID, we weren't able to start that campaign and place those all over the place. So that's what we would like to do. But as you can see, it places UCLA clearly, but within a Tonawanda relevant landscape, with all the different village sites around us. So these are just 3 different representations of maps with 3 different possibilities and 3 different ways to tell stories as well. And what I wanted to say about mapping is, we have always had maps. We had maps that far preceded colonization and European and American destructions of our landscapes and sacred sites, whether through development or actual intentioned destruction, which has happened. But the ways these maps are constructed are different as well. They have different elements to it. At times, particularly in Warhouse, Mark Warhouse makes this clear in his book, Another America, which is a collection of maps from the 1600s on in the Americas. He makes clear that often a map could enclose temporality in it. It would have different ways of constructing that map that was not the same as the Cartesian map, where there was really a mapping of landscapes to turn them into property owning parcels. Rather, our maps sometimes they could convey seasonal elements, or they could convey how long it took to get from one place to the other. So rather than it being meted out in a Cartesian map, sometimes there was a shortness between places because it took less time to get there. So maps have always been a part of Indigenous cultures in America. So that's first to be known. And often sometimes those maps would carry stories with them. What we see today is a really burgeoning of contemporary Indigenous cartographers over the last years. In some ways, they're art cartography, which is just stunning and beautiful. We currently have a GIS person working with Mapping Indigenous LA, Laura Nunez, who is Chumash and Tonawanda, and I think she's Tonawanda and Chumash. I'll have to check on that. But Lauren is working with us, and we're looking at redoing some of the Esri maps that we did on this particular platform for Indigenous LA. Now, the story maps that we created, we didn't want to do the Cartesian maps as you see in the middle here, but we wanted to tell a story with the maps, the story of LA that you can't really get through just by looking. Now, I say this because there's a way that many people look at this counter mapping process as a way that acknowledgement is enough. In some ways, that's what counter mapping can do. It can acknowledge something, but it can't move us forward into thinking about what can we move? How can we move these ideas forward into the future? So what you often can see in a counter map is there might be a representation on a map, such as these are the historic villages of Tonawanda. But what you can't see, what you see in our story maps that you wanted to capture, are those ongoing relationships people have with the land that they are on. So what we see also is like Google has a counter mapping and they have an Indigenous Mapping Day, which is marking places on a map. Often that can also be very dangerous, particularly if you're marking native sites or native territory, because there is such an anti-Indian hatred in some areas in the United States on reservation territories. So those dangers we also wanted to avoid in Indigenous LA. Now, countermapping occurs when the map points out and demonstrates through the cartographical, which is often a Cartesian map, unequal distributions of materials, or even sometimes in overrepresentations, such as there's a way that people have a fascination with mapping out genocidal sites, or mapping out what I call dead Indian spaces. Now, my question there is, where does that get us? How does that get us to a just spatial world? They do not, in that sense, countermapping at times speak to or challenge power relations. So that's something we very much also wanted to get to. Next slide, please. And Mila. So when we set out to do the maps, for me, it was a process that I addressed in my first book of remapping. That is, it's not a returning to a nostalgic or pre-colonial past, or finding a way to non-erase Indigenous people altogether, or it's not the erasing of Indigenous people, representing only as dead or sacred sites, but we wanted to look at what remains and could be important to living peoples. It is to repoliticize the space as Indigenous and work toward the material groundings that can create healthy communities. That was utmost important to us. Again, is that repoliticizing space that can lead to creating healthy communities. It is not a remaking of a colonial map, but a making of them from Indigenous perspectives and understanding Indigenous relationalities, protocols, and the discussion we must have with each other. So the praxis of remapping for me is not that return or uncovering, as I feel like Mila has done, but a making known of ongoing relationships and the work it takes being a guest on Tavanger, because we can all be guests. We don't have to continue in these relationships. And so with that, here's the Mila goals as we laid out, that this is the way the community decided that would be best, what they wanted at the heart of our mapping and Mila project. So this particular, I will now turn it over to Craig because he has a lot more to say about this. Thank you.
So I'm going to get started talking about the way I approach this. And as Mishuana said earlier, you know, we're used to seeing a lot of these Cartesian maps that that she had behind her, especially the one in the middle of Tonga territory. And I wanted to go beyond that when I was thinking of ways to approach this project. And, you know, we're used to seeing these boundaries on these maps, but I always tell people to remember that the Tonga people, my ancestors, you know, before colonization, they weren't just connected, you know, through linguistic boundaries. There were marriage ties, there were trade alliances that people had. So how do you show that on a map? If you're just showing linguistic boundaries, you know, that's just one dimensional. It really doesn't say too much. I mean, you would have to have a map with all these different layers on it, and that gets kind of complex. So when I started approaching the work that we're doing for Mila and some of these exercises that I wanted to do for the teachers and the students, I started thinking about mind mapping and using mind mapping as a way to visually illustrate, you know, what I wanted to basically get across. And for those of you who aren't familiar with mind mapping is something that we really do every day. It's something, you know, when you're thinking about a project, you have to think of everything that's going to go into that project, right? So then you start at the actual idea and then branch out from there. Anything that you approach, you know, is going to be the same way. But when I was approaching this mind mapping, because I'm a visual person, that's how I attempted to, you know, start this. And so for me, what I wanted to do was to really give the students and the teachers an idea about what nature really means to us as Indigenous people, and, you know, how we are tied to it, how we're, you know, connected to it, and you can't really sever that. And so I had to go back to creation narratives. I had to go back to these first instructions that we were given as human beings on how to conduct ourselves on the landscape. And so that's how I approached it. So because of colonization, you know, we don't have a lot of these narratives left, but, you know, what I could gather from what we had left I started to do this mapping. And so I'm kind of jumping ahead right now, so I guess we can go to the next slide, because I just wanted to give a really brief background on the mind mapping. And this is kind of a rough draft of the mind mapping, where you had started out, drawing actually, different shapes, different images, different things that come to your mind on a piece of paper. And then nowadays there's apps that you can use, there's software that you can use to get a little more sophisticated, which the next slide will talk about, or it'll show you. So there's different types of mind mapping, right? And so it starts with that one central idea, and then it just branches out from there. And all these different ideas, these different topics that are related in some different way. So next slide. And it can be any topic. It can be, education. It can be, like I said, a project you're working on at home. It can be so many different things. So next slide. For mine, I really wanted to focus on relationships, because really that's what it's all about. And my question was to these teachers and to these students was, what's your relationship with the nature? And to get people to start refocusing their cultural lens to the landscape and the importance of that. And so that's where I started, and I went back to the narratives in the next slide. And so that kind of, is the backdrop of the Los Angeles cityscape. And most people are used to seeing that in the background. They're not really used to see, in downtown LA where we're at, they're not used to seeing what's up front. But people don't stop and think to realize that as long as human beings have been on the earth, they've relied more on the nature than they have on the technology that we have today. And people don't realize that there was a relationship that was built on reciprocity. And that's what enabled people to survive on the landscape. So I really wanted to give an element of that. And that's how I started with the narrative. And so if you go to the next slide, it's kind of clear there, because there's all the things that we need as humans today, right? There's food, clothing, shelter, all these different things. But today, all those things we get from a store, right? We don't go out in nature and harvest or hunt like my ancestors did. But people have been doing that for thousands of years. It's only been recently where we started to do that. And once you do that, you sever the tie that you have with nature, because you no longer rely on it, you no longer appreciate it, you no longer honor it. It's ignored, and it becomes a commodity. It becomes something to exploit. But those are the things that I wanted to do with this. And so I put them into these categories right here. It's, with the kids, it's easy to understand food, clothing, and shelter. But then I added medicine, I added utilitarian also to this. So it started out in our narratives, it starts out with, the rock and stone people being the first, the ones that formed the earth. And then after that comes the plant people, and then the animal people. And the last to emerge on this earth was us as human beings, because we're the most vulnerable of all the creations, and we needed everything else to really help us to survive. So we, we're told never to separate ourselves from nature, to always be a part of it. And so the next slide will kind of show what I was trying to illustrate with that. So in the middle of the circle, you see the rocks and stones. And eventually on the last ring on the outside are human beings, and not because they dominate, but because they're meant to take care of everything and balance everything inside that circle. And so from there, I started thinking, okay, well, what do humans, what have they always needed to survive? And again, it's food, clothing, and shelter, right? But what forms do that come in? Well, with my ancestors, it's been, either an animal, a rock or stone, or a plant. One of those that provided that, survival, that sustenance. And so that means that you better have a good relationship with that, right? If it's there for your survival, and you better learn how to take care of it. So I went through the beginning with food, clothing, shelter, and I picked out an animal, a plant, or a rock or mineral. And so that's what you really see illustrated up there. And because I wanted the students to be able to make those connections, because it's really about mapping relationships. That's what this whole thing is about. It's visually being able to look at it and see, how you're connected. And so that's what I did with this. But me, in my mind, being, raised in Western society, right, I thought, okay, we can put everything into these little, nice little neat categories, right? Well, it doesn't always work that way with my ancestors, because I thought, what about, where would deer fit into this? Deer doesn't go into just one category. Or what about elderberry, which is a plant that we use for a lot of things? It's food, it's medicine. So then it started getting a little complicated, right? So there were animals, plants, rocks, and stones that defied being put in one category. So then that goes to the next slide. And that's where, in this one, I'm focusing specifically on a plant. And one of the things that I've always heard with people is talking about things from nature that I go out and harvest, about referring to them as natural resources. And it became a bad name for me to say that, because when I thought of natural resources the way the general public use it, it usually involves commodification and exploitation. And I thought, that's not the relationship that I have with these plants. So I thought, what about calling them relatives instead of resources? And that totally changes your relationship with it, or at least it should. And so that's what I wanted to do for the kids too. I wanted them to start thinking of these animals and plants and even the rocks and stones as relatives, because they're the ones that enabled us to survive on the landscape. So I took this image of the elderberry and all the things culturally that we use from this plant, and I looked at it as gifts that the plant is giving us, because they're really giving us these gifts to survive. So you take it from the berries, and you can follow it really through its whole cycle, seasonal cycles, beginning in spring with the berry or the blossoms, and then the berries. And then eventually we take, after it's harvested, we take the wood for making flutes, for clapper sticks, musical instruments, different things. But then that's just, us as humans, that's our use with the plant. That's our relationship with the plant. And I thought, what about everything else that needs this plant, or has a relationship with this plant? So then I started adding the animals that utilize the plant for nesting, for foraging, for different things, because then it becomes a very integrated ecosystem. And when you remove one thing from it, it changes everything. And so that's why I felt it was necessary to put those in there and to see the relationships that not only us humans have, but all life has with, each other. And so I think the next slide we can go to, I think that's it. And so, I think we're We're going to be having some questions later on too that I could probably add a little more to. I'm going to go ahead and I don't know if Mishuana was going to talk about this or Julianne is going to talk about the Pacific Island story maps, but I'll end
Julianne's got it. She's our girl for this.
Thank you, Craig. What a treat to hard act to follow. But so hi, everybody. So this is one of our new story maps that we've been working on, and specifically with the Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian community here in Southern California. And so I'm very grateful to our co-PIs, Mishuana and team with Mila, for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. And also I'm very grateful for Craig and Cindy, who have been our Tongva elders in helping us think through this project. So just a little bit of a background, since this is an ongoing project. We decided to work with a community organization called EPIC, or Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, as well as partner with other collaborations that were happening at the time, for instance, the 2020 census. And this was one of the ways for us to be in the community, but also introduce Mila or the project in the community. So fortunately, this also establish a roadmap for us to collect stories and whatnot. But our goal has been to collect stories around histories and narratives that along the lines with the census, but also we have a lot of elders and educators in the Pacific Island Native Hawaiian communities that have done this work for years, and specifically we interviewed elders in the Hawaiian, Samoan, Native Hawaiian, Samoan, Tongan, and Chamorro communities who have also shared their stories. And these are the largest communities here in LA about, migration. And most of these migration periods in the 50s and 60s has been tied to US militarism, as well as sort of religious institutions. So these are the kind of stories we've been collecting. We hope to, once COVID allows us to move around more freely, we'll probably collect more stories from Micronesian communities, specifically folks in the Marshall Islands and Chuuk. And so I think also I just want to just acknowledge our great team here at EPIC, specifically Natasha Sailua and Tabai and Sina, who have also been a part of this whole project. And as Craig and Mishuana said, this really is a collaboration of many people. As we say in the islands, it takes a village to do this work. So as well as, Professor Mishuana and Melia has also had undergrad and graduate students who have also kicked us off in starting off the Pacific Island story maps here in Southern California. So I think just to wrap up, I just want to point folks to a policy report that EPIC has published. If you're interested around these issues around, Pacific Islanders in Southern California and more broadly national policies, that would be a good starting point and a good space to take a look at. And so I think now I'm going to stop there and pass the Zoom mic over to my colleagues Caroline and Todd, who are going to talk about the mapping in Jewish LA. So thank you, everybody.
Yahweh.
Great, thank you. So, good evening. My name is Todd Presner. I'm a faculty member at UCLA, and it's an honor to follow on Mishuana and Craig and Julianne in Mapping Indigenous LA. It's a project that over the years I've followed and been really quite inspired by. And I think you'll see a number of connections in terms of our approach to mapping and thinking about crafting cartographies that intersect with the approach of Mapping Indigenous LA. And I think this is also one of the reasons that the Fowler had the idea to bring us together, and also the project, which you'll hear after us, around on Vermont. So Mapping Jewish LA started about 10 years ago. And I should say that there is a URL that you could go to, which is just mappingjewishla.org. You can follow along there, and you can see all the live digital exhibitions that we'll be talking about today. It started about 10 years ago, and I was the director at the time of UCLA's Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, and very quickly had the pleasure of meeting Carolyn Luce, who was finishing up a history PhD at UCLA and has since become the associate director and the lead digital curator for Mapping Jewish LA. And you'll hear from her in just a moment. The two of us have been working together really intensely, I would say, for the past maybe 5 or 6 years, as we began to think about what it would mean even to have an approach to mapping Jewish LA. And we were very intentional about calling it mapping because we were really interested in this as a process, right? As opposed to maps of Jewish LA, which kind of indicate a sort of fix, like something that's fixed, that you could locate Jews, so to speak, on a map, or Jewish culture or Jewish history. And of course you can do that, and that's a useful thing to do. But we were really interested in that process. And that process also meant working with community partners. It meant working with students. It meant working with organizations. It meant working with librarians and archivists, and also people that had archives in their basements, because so much of the basis of mapping Jewish LA is also to bring out the archive and to contextualize the archive in ways that I think often when it's seen in isolation, we don't really understand the specificity of the geographic or the biographical or the cartographic. And that is really at the heart of what mapping Jewish LA is about. So we can go to the next slide, please. So we'll give you a kind of a panorama of a number of different projects of what Mapping Jewish LA is about. But first and foremost, I should say, it's a set of digital exhibitions. These are all multimedia exhibitions. They are visual, they have sound, they have text, they have images, interactive maps, and various components. You can click on things and reconfigure things and really begin to ask some of your own questions about what Jewish LA culturally, historically, has looked like, but also what it could look like, because there's a speculative dimension, I think, in many of these maps. It's not just about, how do we think about the past, particularly past that often, get erased or have not been sufficiently inscribed in historical texts, but also it has a kind of futurity. And I think this is a connection that is very important, between many of these mapping projects, because it's about, spatial justice was already brought up by Mishuana, but it's also an approach to social justice, and it's an approach to thinking about how we think about community, because Jewish LA is not in a vacuum, right? Jewish LA is intersecting with many different LAs, Indigenous LA, African-American LA, Mexican-American LA, Japanese-American LA. And of course, if you take, kind of the historical epicenter of Jewish LA, Boyle Heights, we have to tell a multi-ethnic story, right? And you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, and you have scores of nationalities speaking many different languages. And one of the things that we truly wanted to appreciate is the different layers that are kind of coexisting in a neighborhood. And I mean cultural layers, linguistic layers, denominational layers, right? All these things are kind of there. And how do we appreciate that? Well, the approach that we've taken is something that we call thick mapping, right? An idea of a thick map is a map that has all these different dimensions: media, time, relationality, is really collaborative. And I think, in some ways is similar to what Mishuana said about counter mapping, because it may provide an approach to mapping that isn't in the traditional kind of, top-down ideas of what a map is or what it could be. Often these maps are not, in some ways they're speaking back or maybe reinscribing a story that used to be there, but is no longer visible, right? So even in calling, looking at the history of Cesar Chavez, which of course bisects Boyle Heights, it was named Cesar Chavez in 1994. Before that, it was Brooklyn Avenue, perhaps to, attract people, from the East Coast out west. But it's amazing to think of all those layers that are on a single street, right? If you went down the street and you looked at them by building, by story, by person, how would you imagine, it would be possible to create a map, right? It would be a truly thick map. And that's been sort of our approach. We've also thought a lot about the affordances of what digital mapping means, like how to create interactivity, how to open up maps for community-based projects, how to work with, I noticed Herschel Hartman was in the participant list. He was one of the translators for Yiddish culture, a project that Carolyn Luce will talk about in a moment. We've done projects on Iranian Jewish LA, on Sephardic Los Angeles, on Boyle Heights, on Fairfax, on the neighborhoods. but also trying to understand, the individuals, right? The peoples. So you'll hear a little bit from my colleague about Hugo Ballen in a moment, and you'll hear about the murals that he created, many of which are very well known, but some of which are less known. And part of the intention of the project, again, is to think about the Jewish history and Jewish culture in this intersectional and truly transversal way. Right? Sometimes we think of Jewish history and, we stop in New York. And of course, New York is an important point, but we wanted a bi-coastal, relationality. And we also wanted to think, globally too, which is really where the Sephardic project comes in, where we're thinking about the role and the role in immigration history from North Africa, from Turkey, from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Why don't we go ahead to the next slide, and this will actually be the last slide I talk about before I turn it over to my colleague, Carolyn Luce. But one of our initial approaches, and I call this thin mapping because this is like dots on a map, and dots on a map are interesting and a fascinating place to start. And so I don't want to in any way say this is not useful, but I do want to say that if you move from thin mapping to thick mapping, we turn dots on a map into stories. And as soon as you have stories, you also have people. You have biographies, you have relationships, you have encounters, you have intersections, right? And so one of the first maps that we did, this is actually all the way back in now 6-7 years ago, was we wanted to map the history of the Jewish community, looking at community and service, looking at education and religious institutions, looking at political and philanthropic organizations. And this was done by a colleague of ours, Karen Wilson, at the time. And she consulted many different sources to produce this map. It looks simple, but it's really not, because it maps the history of Jewish institutions from the 19th century, late 19th century, all the way up to 2012. And it's an animated map. So if you're in the mappingjewishla.org website, you can play the map and sort of see the geographic kind of spread of Jewish organizations going back really to the 1880s, when you have a population of like 136 Jews, according to the census, in Los Angeles. And now we think of, more than 500,000, living in the Los Angeles area. What record is left behind? And the record is tremendous, right? In terms of philanthropic organizations, religious, schools, and everything else. We consulted the WPA's Religious Institutions Directory from the 1940s, American Jewish yearbooks from 1908 and 1909, things that have never been digitized or really kind of taken seriously. Directory of Jewish Federations, the Jewish Community Directory from the 1950s, in order to understand where those organizations were on the map, because we were interested in putting them on the map, right? And then creating this map of movement. But this wasn't enough to stop. We couldn't just stop with dots on a map. And that's where we started to think, okay, what if we take the archive and now really begin to kind of richly think about what these dots represent in terms of stories, in terms of sources. And here, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Carolyn, who will tell you a little bit about sort of how we went from dots to people, to culture, to history.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, next slide here. I actually hadn't planned to talk about this exhibit very much, Hugo Ballen's Los Angeles, but to put it briefly, succinctly, Ballen was a sort of wunderkind of the Beaux-Arts school in New York, who came to LA in the early 1920s in search of a career in Hollywood, and sort of combined those skills to become one of the most prolific muralists of the sort of Beaux-Arts school in LA. And what we did in this exhibit was combine a layer of a sort of traditional biographical essay tracing his career, which we periodized into these 4 periods. And then each of those contains special focus on those various murals that defined that part of his career, often with sort of annotations that you may be able to see on the left here. This is the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, probably Ballen's most well-known, at least to Angelino's mural. He also did the Griffith Park Observatory, which you'll see in the Reluctant Modernist period, Burbank City Hall. So, we wanted to combine his personal history, the history of those institutions, the history of art, and specifically public art in Los Angeles, and then this archive, this incredible, beautiful archive. I'll take the opportunity here to give credit to our designer, David Wu, who is largely responsible for how wonderful and beautiful our exhibits look. So Mapping Jewish LA has about a dozen exhibits and a few more in production, and they generally fall into two categories. First, as Todd described, we aim to locate Jews on the physical landscapes of LA by exploring historic Jewish spaces, places, and neighborhoods. One example here, and if you can go to the next slide, is In Search of Fairfax, which was developed by my colleagues Max Baumgarten, who is currently at Cal State LA. And Max really started with a basic question. What makes a neighborhood Jewish, right? I think scholars and popular commentators alike often take that for granted, or they think it's something simple explanation like demographic concentration. But at MJLA, the question of what makes a neighborhood Jewish or what makes a place Jewish is actually something we take very seriously and we try to explore in critical ways, in the way that Todd is describing, where you take a point on the map and then you fill that in with stories, right? So for Max, that meant considering how broader historical trends, including suburbanization, racial integration, and more recently gentrification, have informed Fairfax's status as a Jewish neighborhood, both in terms of physical space and as a conceptual landscape. He's considering how negotiations over the role and structure of this neighborhood generated multiple ideas about its religious, social, and cultural purpose. Next slide. So he combines features both on hallmark institutions, the Farmers Market, Fairfax High School, Cantor's Deli, with quantitative data from archival sources, specifically Jewish communal surveys and the US Census using Social Explorer, which is another mapping project of LA that we didn't actually invite to this session, but is worth noting. Social Explorer is an incredible tool. So Max worked with some folks from the UCLA Sandbox to create these beautiful illustrations. And if you can go to next slide, we can get a little closer view. And what that allows us to do is not only trace the histories of Jewish institutions over time, but also compare Fairfax with both other neighborhoods of Jewish concentration and with other so-called ethnic neighborhoods throughout the city. So I encourage everyone who's a fan of Fairfax, maybe you grew up in Fairfax, maybe you live there now, to check out this wonderful exhibit, because I think what it really illuminates is how an array of neighborhood stakeholders, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, operated in tension and in tandem with each other in an effort to define who and what belonged within the Fairfax community. We also have several exhibits at Mapping Jewish LA that aim to locate Jews on the social, cultural, and literary landscapes of LA through more expansive types of mapping that often don't involve geospatial data at all. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll return to the Yiddish Anthology that Todd mentioned. For those who are unfamiliar, Yiddish is a vernacular language that combines elements of German, Hebrew, and Slavic, and was the basis of a rich and diversified folk culture among Ashkenazi Jews in Europe. As the language of the Jewish masses, it was viewed by some, including the radicals and activists that I research, not simply as a medium of self-expression, but as a mode of belonging, the basis of a secular form of diasporic cultural nationalism that, if cultivated and refined, could sustain Jewish life within and between communities across the world. So as such, many Jewish immigrants to the United States chose to write, speak, and organize in Yiddish, even as they developed fluency in English. And in turn, Yiddish sources provide a critical window into their lives and experiences. But as I learned very quickly when I started my research in graduate school almost 15 years ago now, none of the Yiddish writers of LA have sort of been recovered, right? They've been lost to history. And only a very few of the books that they wrote have been translated. And there have been no scholarly investigations of the dozens of newspapers and literary journals they published. And that severely limits our ability to understand the experiences of Yiddish-speaking Jews, and particularly of the immigrant working class in LA. So this particular project was motivated by that impulse for recovery. It aimed to fill that scholarly gap by mapping the Yiddish literary landscape in LA. And if you can switch the slide, each author is presented as a sort of path that link biographies and scholarly analysis to selected works in translation, as well as rich bibliographic resources for those interested in taking a deeper dive. This one features a poet named Heim Rosenblad, who is described as the poet laureate of LA. And by doing so, it aims to illuminate the interaction between local and regional cultures and transnational Jewish ones that made Yiddish culture so very rich. My favorite example of this kind of dialectic that we're trying to trace here is one of Chaim Rosenblad's poems called Mojave. If you can go to the next slide, translated by Herschel Hartman. Shout out Herschel if you're here. Rosenblatt was describing wildlife for which there are no Yiddish words, like coyotes and blue jays, and later in the poem, what he calls Yehoash trees, right? Joshua trees. This was very confusing for me as a translator, which is why I had to enlist Herschel's help. But I think it really captures the creativity and invention that resulted from the Jewish encounter with the new physical and cultural landscapes of the West. So by creating this anthology in the virtual space and using digital tools that Scalar affords, we were able to sort of identify shared themes, topics, and motifs, and begin for the first time to make some kind of an assessment of the LA Yiddish style. You can change the slide. And we were able to move beyond, to me, this is more important, we were able to move beyond the traditional single author canonical editorial approach, in which one person, often male, imposes their judgment based on sort of ever problematic notions of taste or regional preferences, which is so often the case, right? Because these LA Yiddish writers just kind of fall out of the canon, not necessarily because their work isn't good, but just because they're not from New York or they're not from Chicago, where so much of histories of Yiddish in America focus. So that was really important to me. We were able to adopt this really collaborative, non-hierarchical model with contributors that included multiple scholars, as well as translators, students, community leaders, and octogenarian volunteers. And that's really something you'll see throughout our exhibits at MJLA, and something I think is particularly valuable about these mapping projects is that they invite collaborative communities. They create collaborative communities. They encourage us as humanities scholars to work collaboratively with one another, which we don't often do, and to create opportunities for our students to participate. As Todd mentioned, we have a whole section of MJLA that's just student developed exhibits, which is one of the things I'm really proud of, including that exhibit on Iranian Jewish LA. They also encourage us to forge relationships with neighborhood-based historical societies, heritage organizations, and to tap the deep reservoirs of knowledge that exist out in the community, but not in university archives and libraries. So we had to really rely on all of these collaborative approaches when in 2016, we took on our first physical exhibition from Brooklyn Avenue to Cesar Chavez. And I'm going to turn it back over to Todd, and you can change the slide and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this together a little bit, but the idea of going from a digital mapping environment to a physical mapping environment was something that all of us were really deeply interested in, because so much about the geographies we were talking about, these are lived geographies, right? People don't live in digital maps. They live in houses, and they walk on streets, and they visit stores, or they go to synagogues. And we really wanted to think, like, what would it mean to create a to create a physical exhibition from a digital exhibition, right? So to actually materialize in some ways that experience of space. So if we go to the next slide, this was installed at the Breed Street Shul. So we took these maps, many of which, are, who knows how big they are, a couple feet long. They often sit, in kind of map boxes in a library, often collecting dust. And the first thing we did was we wanted to digitize them and georeference them. So you could actually kind of almost like go between the different times. Like I can go from 1890 to 1920 to 1912, 1930, and so forth. But again, we wanted to animate the maps. So that's where we began to add the archival material, right? Those locations and those histories and those narratives that are often missing on the map when we just focus on streets, right? So let's go to the next slide. Now, of course, maps tell lots of stories, right? Here's a map of Red Line Boyle Heights. This is a WPA map from the late 1930s. It was a red line neighborhood. We know that, of course, after the freeways come, you see the crisscrossing of the East LA interchange and all the freeways that cut Boyle Heights up into pieces. And again, all this can be found if we begin to think about layers, maps almost as layers, or peeling back an onion. This is all fine in the digital realm, but what would it look like in a physical realm? So let's look at the next slide. We took a map from 1921, and this was about 50 feet long and about maybe 25, 30 feet wide, and we embossed it on a floor. And this floor you could walk on. So it's a 1921 map of Boyle Heights. And what was beautiful about this is we thought of the exhibition as kind of like rising out of it, almost like a thick mapping, like put into practice. And that meant like the archival sources, that meant the sounds, the stories, the images, right? All connected with like the street corner, like that particular corner. And if you go to the next map, next slide, you can sort of see how this worked. you would walk on the map. You would walk on the physical map. And this map, I believe, was displayed at the Breed Street Shul for a number of years. I believe it may still actually be there.
It's still there.
It's still there, so you can visit it.
It's going to be too much of a pain to take it out, so we just left it.
Yeah, it's almost like a floor piece. It's like a kind of an installation of a historical map in a historical location, right? And what's beautiful about it is again, it locates, it locates our physical bodies as we walk on the historical map, literally 100 years, right? 100 years have gone by since 1921. We also did a kind of, we'll talk about this maybe in the Q&A, but an AR application where you could take your smartphone on a QR code and sort of see something about the history of that particular, say, street or corner or location that you were looking at. Yeah. Let me go to the last slide and I'll turn it back to you, Carolyn. And there's a picture of the exhibition and you can kind of see at the bottom right, people on the map, right?
Yeah, I would just say that, one of the challenges that we had with this exhibit that we're really trying to think more deeply as we can move from, because now we're moving back into the digital, right? This was a physical exhibition that we're now transforming into a virtual exhibition, and I can talk about that more later. But it's really important here, and those layered maps reveal this, right? Is that while there was this incredible convergence in Boyle Heights, as I did some census research in the 1930 census, it's included in the exhibit, 43 different nationalities, right? 43 different countries of origin, immigrant communities represented in Boyle Heights in the early 20th century. Those maps and those layers of those maps illustrate the divergence of experience, right? Jews had afforded a certain level of mobility thanks to their whiteness, thanks to their comparative affluence that allowed them to leave en masse when those red lines were imposed and when those freeways came down in a way that their Black and brown neighbors were not. So, one of the things we really have to think about when we talk about these layered histories and we talk about these intersecting stories is both the points of convergence and the points of divergence, and really thinking through relational ways of thinking about race and space. And that's going to be key to us as we move forward with the digital exhibit. I was relating a lot to what Julianne was saying because we had all these grand intentions to work with Roosevelt High students and members of the Boyle Heights Historical Society and other local community groups on ways to really expand and actually empower current residents of the neighborhoods to help us expose these history and peel back these layers. But COVID has kind of snuffed all that out. So the exhibit is currently at the Boyle Heights Historical Studios, History Studios, run by my friend Shmuel Gonzalez, and we're thinking about ways that once we come out of this terrible, terrible time, that we might, really make this collaborative community come to life and all the depth that can add to the project that we're pursuing. So I think we'll leave it there. Todd, yeah, you okay? All right, and pass it on over to the Vermont Avenue folks. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you.
Okay, wow, I mean, it's such amazing projects and outcomes there. So it's my pleasure to be here as a representative of the Fowler Museum and of the Vermont Avenue project, of which I'm going to talk about a bit here, and then I'll turn it over to Chris Greene to sort of bring it home and talk about his participation in this project. And again, as we introduced a little bit at the beginning of the program, the work that we've been doing along Vermont Avenue is really part of a process of discovery that goes along with our lived religion project, now graciously funded by the Lilly Endowment. And so we're really in a place of looking for some continued emergence of what comes from our research and our mapping and engagement with communities. And when I say emergence, what I mean is that we're funded now for a 3-year implementation project that is going to present exhibitions, public programming like this, a number of forms of innovative digital learning and outreach. And so we're excited to see the kinds of places this can go. And of course, the mapping projects that we've all been looking at right here provide wonderful kinds of signposts and maps in and of themselves to sort of shape what's going to be happening at the Fowler over the next few years. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk about a little bit is just sort of why Vermont Avenue and what that means for us to be talking about mapping religious sites on this particular thoroughfare in Los Angeles. And ultimately, this really does grow out of a long-standing engagement of the Fowler Museum with local communities in particular in representing artistic and cultural traditions. And so it's really connecting the museum to a wide variety of cultural traditions. And so certainly this has been a large part of my work at the museum as a curator over the years. But also this emerged out of more lived everyday practice, which was for me, myself, I tried to spend as much time as possible walking around Los Angeles. And for a number of reasons, I found myself often on Vermont Avenue and just strolling along the street, different parts here and there of a strip of asphalt and concrete that's roughly 23 miles. And really pretty quickly it became clear to me, and perhaps it should have been earlier, came clear to me that this street, the Vermont Avenue, is an incredible cross-section of our city. And as it moves from the Santa Monica Mountains down to the harbor, it moves through. It represents. It forms a foundation of an incredibly diverse sets of neighborhoods and communities and blocks. That it just seemed to me is like this is a place. This is a place to spend time getting to know better, to understand who we are collectively. And so what the approach here was, of course, in the register of religious behavior and religious activity. And so the one fundamental goal really was to explore the full length of Vermont Avenue, charting, mapping out places of worship, sites of everyday or vernacular religious activity. And again, Chris in several minutes will talk to us a little bit more about sort of the technical process of creating ArcGIS maps of this street. Myself coming at it from a curatorial perspective and as a researcher, my interest was, okay, I want to get into these spaces. I want to engage with representative communities, to have dialogues, to have discourses. And again, with an ultimate goal of understanding these processes would develop exhibitions and public programming in the future for the museum, which is going to happen. And so one central part of this was just recognizing physical spaces, brick and mortar places of religiosity, of a diverse number of religious traditions, of spiritual practices. And so a lot of what went into this project to this date has, again, just been sort of ethnographic research, meeting people, foot on the ground. Now, I would also say that we have the misfortune, of course, of having really started this endeavor just right several months before COVID-19 really struck, and it significantly changed our ability to do this. But nonetheless, with the time of physical interaction and then moving into digital remote interaction, nonetheless, we had an amazing opportunity to develop relationships with particular sites of religious practice, St. Raphael's Catholic Church in South Vermont, the Hollywood Sikh Temple in North Vermont, the Senshin Buddhist Temple by USC. Yeah, I said USC. Yeah, I know. We're all together in this time at this place. We're all of the City of Angels, and the Founders Metropolitan Community Church also on North Vermont were sites and congregations and communities we worked very closely with. Now, another level, and next slide, please. Also, what we're very much interested in is moving beyond the ways in which places of religion typically tend to get put onto maps, which is focus on brick and mortar sites. Here are sort of institutionalized places of worship, and unfortunately, frequently that tends to be the extent of the visibility of religious practice, and certainly in mapping and in cartography. And so what we wanted to do is also to look at the fuller street itself. How do we encounter, how does anyone encounter, how do residents encounter, how do tourists encounter, how do passersby encounter belief and religious practice in its everyday, again, lived in vernacular fashion? And so one thing that quickly becomes clear, and we've also tried to capture that, and this will infuse, again, ongoing programming in terms of exhibitions and so on at the museum, is to understand that also this simply means who you meet on the street. How individuals like Reverend Knuckles in this case makes a sidewalk a place of religious activity, how he turns a sidewalk into sacred ground, right? And why that sidewalk in particular becomes that. And you can't see it in this picture where I'm showing Reverend Knuckles, but he's sitting in front of a recently built little mini mall, little strip mall. It's on the location of what was formerly a very important African-American church that had burned down and was replaced by a commercial site. But that doesn't take the potential for a place of worship away from that corner. And so that as one knows the community and learns more about the community, understand that this is a place on a given Sunday, on a given Saturday, that Reverend Knuckles might be there and worship service is open. Or just the simple realities of life and death in the city as experienced on a particular street. And so we're looking at memorials, death sites, house shrines, simply where religion is manifest in its variety of forms, through human action, through material behavior. And so again, I'll leave this part at that, just to say that what the Vermont Avenue Religious Sites Mapping Project really has been to this point has been a project of encounter. And the goal going forward of these encounters is to expand and increase incorporation, engagement, interaction with the communities for which Vermont Avenue is home. Okay, Chris?
Sure, yeah, I'll pick it up from here. Next slide, please, thank you. So greetings to everyone tuning in today. My name is Christopher Greene, and as curatorial assistant on the Vermont Avenue project, I was mainly tasked with the data collection and digital mapping of religious sites along Vermont Avenue. When I first got brought on for the project, I began the process of identifying and recording the location of various religious sites along the 22-mile stretch of Vermont Avenue, which include, as Patrick had just mentioned, brick and mortar sites of worship, but also murals, billboards, privately owned businesses such as bookstores, tattoo parlors, botanicas, etc., and even at street intersections such as Oscar Romero Square at Vermont Avenue and Pico. So largely relying on internet research, Google Maps, Google Street View, and some physical field research while it was still safe to do so, I compiled a data set of roughly 350 religious sites, each containing some basic attribute information, such as street address and religious tradition where applicable. Using a GIS, or a geographic information system, I was able to apply filters to create new and more specific data sets to dial into specific themes or specific sites of worship, as Patrick had just mentioned, some sites that we've built a relationship with. Next slide, please. I'll keep this succinct since I know we're low on time. So along with creating this geodatabase of sites of religiosity, I also utilized demographic data from the Census Bureau, as well as American Community Survey estimates to further contextualize select religious sites on the Avenue, incorporating socioeconomic factors such as income, predominant ethnicities, or whether a neighborhood is composed of multifamily or single family housing. And I have to make the note that it's not lost on us that incorporating this type of data can be contentious and requires a lot of care, as it can lead to some broad generalizing narratives on people. So with that said, with the data we use, it's important to focus the lens on understanding geographies and how certain religious institutions, or Reverend Knuckles, for example, engage with the communities they're in. Next slide, please. So to wrap this up, the main platform I use to bring these different sets of data together is Esri's Story Maps, which is an interactive platform fusing maps with other forms of media, such as text and images. And as Todd Presner had mentioned, this is where we turn dots on the map into stories, quite literally. The story maps I've created include a digital walking tour, as you guys see here, some site-specific deep dives with some of our partners, and a general project overview. So to conclude, I will just reiterate that a primary goal of the mapping project on my end was highlighting and contextualizing the diversity and frequency of religious sites along an avenue hosting neighborhoods of unique demographics, socioeconomic statuses, and histories. Thank you, and now I will turn the Zoom mic to our general discussion.
Thank you, Chris.
Hello, everybody. It's nice now to see all of us move into the same room, and such fantastic presentations. So wonderful to hear about and think about these projects in relationship to one another. In our remaining time, we're going to have a conversation in which all of the panelists will share insights on some of the themes and questions that really helped generate this panel. So in our time together, we've heard from a variety of projects, and it strikes me that they're all united in some way by their attention to place. Together, they broaden our understanding of Los Angeles, challenge dominant narratives of the city, and prompt important questions about migration, movement, lack of movement boundaries, all within the city. I want to first direct this question to Craig and Mishuana to ask if you can speak more about what you see as the process for learning and thinking through this place in connection to your projects, and if you're moved to mapping in its various forms more broadly.
Craig, do you want to begin, or?
You can go ahead and start, and I'll add Irene.
Well, one of the questions I would say about mappings of place, what do we want these maps to do? What are the outcomes that we desire there? Again, as I said in my acknowledgement, it's not just acknowledging that the Tomba exists here. What are our intents with that? I prefer to use anti-colonial in my work because there's an action taking place. There's a praxis that's working itself out. And so when I asked this question, I asked myself, what are maps doing materially for the communities we work in? So in some ways, when I think through this question and people are like, oh, mapping Indigenous in LA is a decolonial map. I was like, is it though? Because can it be? And the question comes there for me, because while the Tomba do not have any land to launch their TIAD at, we cannot have decolonial maps in Los Angeles until the Tomba have a place to launch their canoe and practice their traditions and to practice their gathering and to practice those relationships with what I have now calling the more than human, after Kim Tallberry does some great work there. But we have to think, what are we doing? What are those material practice? How does mapping, how can it help us make better relations? Yes, but then how can we materially ground those better relations? And mutual aid, here I think of how mutual aid and religion has worked itself out in this awful moment of horrible unequal distribution in Los Angeles of resources and goods and who has a job and where do people have to go on transit for a job, etc. Or how do we think about better environmental understandings of maps? I think here of Craig and his powerful ways that he does mind mapping with children, which it's really wonderful to see it in process because it resets their thinking in relationship to place and land. That became a very important cornerstone for us in MILA, to have people have a different mindset, but also to put that mindset into action. So I guess in thinking about place, I also think not just about how these maps can create new places, but of what are our responsibilities and accountability to being in place. That is, I practice my embodied sovereignty every day as a Haudenosaunee woman. So even when I leave Haudenosaunee territory, I bring with me the philosophies and the political or spiritual or whatever kind of philosophies those are to inform the way I interact on Tomva land. And I hope I do it in a respectful and caring way. Every day I'm in the shower, I think about how much water I'm using in that shower. And I think about my Paiute relatives to the north. those are mapping relationships that are not bounded in a particular territory. Like our water, for instance, consumption doesn't end in Tovangar and this land. We're connected deeply to the Paiute up in Owens Valley. So thinking about that and making place is about creating relationalities, and then not just saying we have them, but acting upon them in a way we're accountable. So that's how I think about making place. What is our accountability? How do we act as a good human being?
I would after that by saying that my approach with the projects that we worked on, the mapping projects is making people understand the indigenous of the land of wherever they're at. I don't care where you're at on this earth. It's not only honoring the indigenous people, the humans of the land, but it's also honoring, the indigenous animals, the plants, all the life on the land, because it's evolved. We have evolved as human beings along with that for thousands of generations, and that there's something to be said about that. There really is something to be said about that. I mean, we survived on the landscape for thousands of generations, not just a few hundred years. So somebody was doing something right. And it's important for people to understand that wherever you go on this earth, there's going to be indigenous people of that land that were given instructions on how to conduct themselves as human beings and how to live in reciprocity with the rest of nature, because it's not just about us as humans alone. We don't survive on our own, even though we think we do. And then it's also to understand that again, how that has evolved with each other over thousands of years. And then the last one that I come to is what are you doing as a guest on the land to ensure that continues, to ensure that those species, those animals, those plants, everything that's indigenous to the land, what are you doing to ensure that it continues on the land? Because that's the only way that we humans are going to survive, is if we understand that. And so it basically comes down to, recognition, respect, and responsibility. And so the last one is the responsibility of any human being who lives on the landscape now. What are you going to do to continue what has been going on for thousands of generations, and that has actually worked? So that was my take on it, on specifically tying it to this place. Because if you go anywhere around the world, every place has different animals and plants. But there are things that are unique to this place, and to be understood on their own terms.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of those responses. I think they really foreground what are our accountabilities, as well as creating those relationalities. And Craig, for me, something that's really standing out from earlier in your presentation as well is this shift to thinking about relatives, not resources, right? As a means of propelling that forward as well. So on this topic, I was wondering if perhaps Patrick and Chris, in your own project, if you might be able to talk to some linkages or how you see your projects as well, helping us think about this place that we're accountable to.
Absolutely, thank you. I mean, I think there are so many points of resonance between the projects we've seen. I mean, the ways in which Todd and Caroline have talked about these layers of historical presence and movement, and as folks establish themselves in one community and move on, and or others come in, and I think we see that powerfully. And so what I would say, the sort of quick things that sort of hit my mind when I think about our project in relationship to placemaking is, one is truly understanding sites of worship places of worship, both formal and informal, are a central place of expression of identity and community, right? In the sites of family presence, family activity, of extended lineages and relationships. And so that the church, the synagogue, the mosque, the botanica becomes a pinpoint. It becomes a place, again, on the map, at which then other aspects of daily life can build out from and and become connected to. And so one for me is just the continued recognition, realization of how central places of worships are to the very idea of community, and that they are where it exists in moments of time, to say the least. Now, the other thing I say, and then I'll let Chris jump in here, is for me, honestly, the more important reality that confronted me and that engaged me, and we're frankly still working out exactly how to approach this. For me, it was the construction of sacred spaces, of sites of religious practice by the homeless, by exceedingly pressured communities. And within homeless encampments in Los Angeles, it's not at all unusual to see sacred space set aside, created for worship. And when I talked to one gentleman who maintained and continues to maintain a shrine in the windowsill of a building that lets him do it, a shrine dedicated to the Virgin of Guadalupe, I asked him about it. And it really, I mean, if I may paraphrase his words, it was frankly, essentially, we're out here at night, and at night, all the churches are closed. And with her here with us, we're not alone. And if you don't look, if you don't really dig into the map, into the street, you don't see that. And then if you don't see that, you don't come to understand that reality, that necessity of human seeking for the divine, if I could put it that way. Chris, I mean.
Yeah, just a thought I had regarding my end of the mapping project was that regarding placemaking and having Vermont Avenue as a transect of cultural intersection, there's a certain duality, I think, that can be conveyed with this mapping project, as where, with the data that I've used, oftentimes I find myself highlighting these immense social disparities in terms of income, mobility, education, development. But also, I think that one theme that can be expressed is that in spite of all of these economic and geographic separations, such as I think it was mentioned earlier, the legacies of redlining, of housing segregation in the city, in spite of all of these disparities, religion kind of serves as a framework to allow us to see a cohesive and culturally rich city by viewing it on a transect. So I think that's pretty interesting that there is a duality there.
Yeah. I feel like one of the themes that you're bringing together, another point of connection in the panel, is the attention that all of these projects bring to spatial expressions of belief. I was wondering if here maybe Caroline or Todd or Julianne might want to expand more on the ways that you see your projects bringing insights into spiritual practices to a public audience. Here you might also think about considerations over questions of interpretation, or how you grapple with some of the complications that they may present.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I actually am going to sort of answer it as a way of getting at the previous question as well, which is to say that, one of the things I tried to mention, we were talking about the Yiddish exhibit, that is really true of Jewish life, history, and culture more broadly, is that there is this dynamic interaction between the kind of local and specific context, local, regional, national contexts of the communities where Jews live, and then these transnational dynamics, traditions, cultures, customs. And it's that interplay between them that we're trying to showcase in Mapping Jewish LA. We're both trying to say, what about this is Jewish? And also, what about this is Los Angeles, right? And that dynamic interplay between them. So trying to balance that tension between the kind of local and the transnational is tricky when it comes to religion. So one of the projects we have at Mapping Jewish LA that I'm going to plug here, SephardicLosAngeles.org, traces the 100-year history of the Sephardic community. To put it briefly, Sephardic Jews were descendants of the Jews who were expelled from Spain and sort of scattered in communities across this incredible, I mean, the landscape of the Sephardic diaspora spans from North Africa through the Eastern Mediterranean into the Middle East, and even, depending on how you define it, some identify as Mizrahi, but all the way through the Middle East to Asia. And the Sephardic diaspora here contains communities from all of those parts of the world. So, you know, we wanted to be sure that we're addressing and thinking about the particular, right, the particular local faith traditions, patterns of worship, cultural traditions of these various and sundry communities. So, for example, in Morocco, the bakashot, these are songs of praise to God that are often infuse Hebrew and Arabic, and they sound a lot like Muslim prayers. Whereas the Sephardim from Ottoman lands in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey and Greece, have Spanish romanzos, these ballads that they sing in Ladino, which is a dialect of Judeo-Spanish. But also we wanted to deal with the ways that these various communities came together and kind of melded traditions to create these kind of uniquely Los Angeles forms. And one of the ways we do that is we talk about the Siddur, the prayer book that they use at Sephardic Temple Tifereth Israel, who is our partner on the exhibit, the largest and oldest Sephardic synagogue in LA. And this Siddur combines elements, the congregation brings together folks whose families have been here for 100 years, who came from Ottoman lands, as well as more recent arrivals from Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They have a huge Iranian part of their congregation. And so they use this prayer book that kind of melds all those things together. And we try to spotlight that and think about the ways that it does that with language, with prayer forms and rites. So so I'd say that tension between the kind of local, regional, specific, and then the transnational elements here that allow us to kind of tell the story of this incredibly diverse diaspora that's converged in LA. Todd, you want to add?
That was perfect, Carolyn. And I don't want to add. I want to give Julian the microphone though.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think for us with the Pacific Islanders story maps, one of the challenges that we had discussions about at the beginning was thinking about how to represent a vast but also diverse Pacific Islander community. So this is part of the kind of work that we did, was working with local community organizations. But the other part that we also wanted our various communities to understand is their relationship to the Indigenous communities here in LA, and the Tongva, the Gabrielino peoples. Like, how do we relate to folks with their Indigenous beliefs as well as value systems, also, implementing our Pacific Islander communities as well. So this was a conversation that I'm not sure, and I think, Craig and Mishuana has been talking very clearly about this, is kind of what is our responsibilities within our own communities to acknowledge and account for, when we're in these spaces. So I think that's something that we're constantly negotiating within our communities, because Pacific Islanders in a way have fraught histories of being in the US, right? Whether it's displacement, war, nuclear free, or nuclearization in the Pacific, or various other aspects, the military. So I think there's just a lot there of layers there, as Todd and Caroline have talked about, to kind of unpeel within these relationships, but also to think about place as a space for potential. So I'm really excited about that aspect.
Thank you, Julianne. And I think that's an important and urgent note to end on, that responsibility and accountability. And I think everyone brings really important attention to the linkages and calls to action that your projects put forward. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for the moment, but I do hope these conversations will continue. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bianca.
Yes, thank you to all of our 9 participants in this program for sharing such valuable insights into the city that we Angelinos all think that we know so well, but it turns out there are hidden histories everywhere, and with your help, we will reveal them. Thank you so much for enlightening us and giving us such great food for thought. And thank you to everyone who joined us. This program has been recorded. It will be available on the Fowler website and on our Instagram for you guys to revisit and share. And we hope that you'll join us again next time for our upcoming program tomorrow. Details can be found on the closing slide. Thank you, everyone, again. Have a good night.
Thank you.